Salem City Council will hold a joint public meeting with the Planning Board in person in the City Council Chambers, City Hall, 93 Washington Street, second floor, Salem, Massachusetts, on Monday, April 29th, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. in accordance with Chapter 40A laws, Section 50, Section 5 of the Massachusetts General Laws for the purpose of discussing 3 zoning ordinance amendments relative to Coastal Resiliency Overlay District, Flood Hazard Overlay District, and amending Section 2.2 Overlay District to add Coastal Resilience Overlay District, CROD, to a list of overlay districts. In person shall be the primary method of public access to such meetings. A secondary method of public access may be provided if technologically feasible through Salem Access Television and/or remotely through Zoom. Please see below. The public hearing is to provide interested parties with an opportunity to comment on these zoning amendments. The complete text of these 3 zoning ordinances are available in the backup documentation at the City Clerk's Office, 93 Washington Street, Salem, or the Planning Department, City Hall Annex 98 Washington Street, Salem, during normal working hours. Public may watch the meeting live on SATV on channel 22. We have all members of the council present, and I will turn it over to Chair Sides to take attendance on the Planning Board side.
Good evening, Ellen Sides, Chair for tonight. Carol Anderson is absent. Zachary Thompson.
Present.
I am present. Kurt Reader is absent. Tom Fury.
Present.
Sarah Target. And Bill Bissett is absent. Jonathan Burke. Present. Josh Turtle is absent.
Also in attendance here with us, we have Tom Daniel, Director of Planning. Tom Devine is joining us remotely as Senior Planner. Andrew Gorman, Senior Environmental Planning Specialist, Beals and Thomas. Amanda Chincola, Deputy Planning Director. Robin Lee, Planner. Neil Duffy, Sustainable and Resiliency Director. And I think Deb Duhamel, City Engineer. Madam City Clerk.
An ordinance amending zoning by adding Section 8.9 Coastal Resiliency Overlay District. We're going to do the video presentation before we...
Do you need to read your portion first before we... Okay.
That's all. I just need to read that.
Okay. So I guess what we'll do here is, we have 3 separate zoning amendments here that we're going to discuss. So we're going to do these one at a time for everybody. We'll have a presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions from the council, questions from the planning board. We'll have the public comment, and then we will take action on the item in front of us, and then we'll move to the next one. So three separate ordinances. So Tom Daniel, I believe you're first here.
Good evening, councilors and members of the planning board. I'm Tom Daniel, Director of Planning and Community Development, and I'm going to be super brief before I turn things over. But I just wanted to set the context a little bit for the ordinances tonight. So this work goes back about 2 years ago, and really is an outgrowth from 2 years prior to that, our work on the wetlands ordinance and regulations. That process, revealed things that, or through that process, there were items that came up that weren't appropriate or weren't the best fit for the wetlands ordinance and were more appropriate in zoning. And so we, put that to the side, and after we finished the wetlands work, we moved on to this. So it's been about a 2-year process. Salem's climate work is much longer than that, and Tom Devine has a slide here that you'll see, going back about 10 years. And so the city's climate work is in lots of different areas. We can be infrastructure, and that can be hard infrastructure or green infrastructure, programs that we have, education and outreach, advocacy, and then policy work, such as before you tonight. When we started this particular policy work about 2 years ago, was planning and the sustainability and resiliency departments that kicked it off. Engineering has been right there with us, so I'm really happy that Neil and Deb are here tonight as well. As we've done with our processes like this, we have a working group, and I really need to applaud the members of the working group that served for about 2 years on this. Really, really thoughtful, deliberative discussions, a lot of reading, a lot of learning, a lot of going back and forth trying to find the right balance for this. So many thanks to those working group members. We're joined tonight by Andrew Gorman from Beals and Thomas, the Beals and Thomas team. We had worked on the wetlands ordinance, so it was great to be able to continue with them on this. And I really want to give a shout out for Tom Devine, senior planner, who's been managing this process, communicating with the working group members, doing a ton of research, working with the Beals and Thomas team, meeting with elected officials and community members as well, and doing it all very, very gracefully and thoroughly. So thank you, Tom, and I will turn it over to you.
Please tell me if you're not hearing me the way you should through the audio. Thank you, Tom. There's a few people that Tom Daniel didn't mention who should be recognized who aren't here tonight. One is Stacy Minahane of Beals and Thomas. She's been integral to the work. Alex Weissheet of KP Law, who did our legal review. Maria Josephson, the city's GIS technician, and our intern Jessica November, who created the zoning map. I want to thank the council and the planning board for the chance to present tonight. Some of you will find a lot of this familiar because you attended the the committee of the whole last year when we gave a preliminary presentation, or the public forum also last year. I have met individually with the 3 new members of the council to make sure everyone's on the same equal footing tonight. These proposed zoning changes do 2 things. One, they require buildings to be resilient to projected future worsening flood risk. And 2, they keep the city eligible for federal flood insurance. But I want to echo what Tom Daniel said. There's a lot more going on besides this in our response to climate change. And there's a lot more work that happens beyond this zoning change. In fact, there's going to have to be continued ongoing planning to prioritize what programs, policies, and infrastructure projects we put in place to protect what in the city, where, and for how long. There will be some areas of the city that we cannot protect forever. Those are hard decisions that we have to make in the future. But that additional work is just another necessary step, just like this zoning ordinance, to have a full, robust response to the threat of climate change in Salem. I look at this as a comprehensive zoning change for flood resiliency for buildings, but procedurally, as the council president said, this is 3 separate hearings. The first is for the proposed Climate Resiliency Overlay District, or CROD. A little bit of background on how we got to where we are tonight. As Tom Daniel mentioned, we've been doing climate work in Salem for a while now. It looks to me like it's about 10 years. I count at least a dozen projects or initiatives that included some sort of neighborhood or citywide climate outreach or engagement. I want to highlight just the 3 that relate most directly to the zoning changes that are proposed. In 2020, Salem Sound Coast Watch and the National Park Service hosted the Woods Hole Group when they introduced the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model and Salem-specific maps to the community. In 2022, as Tom Daniel mentioned, the city adopted a wetlands ordinance update that, among other things, made changes, including giving the Conservation Commission authority to consider climate change in its review of development within flood zones. But as Tom Daniel mentioned, that had a scope that was limited to ecological purview, so the conversation continued onto this work for a zoning ordinance that more directly protects human health, safety, and welfare. In 2022, the final report for the El Punto Resilient Together study was issued. It included a recommendation to update our flood ordinance to incorporate future flood risk. So that's what we're doing here tonight. So the engagement that we've done for the zoning changes build off of that 10 years of engagement and climate work. We launched a webpage that we've maintained with project information and updates. And as I mentioned, we had a public forum last year. We presented to the Committee of the Whole. I also presented at a public meeting of the Sustainable Energy and Resiliency Committee. Our working group has met 8 times since mid-2022. The working group had good discussions to work through all of the elements of the zoning changes, and what's before you tonight is where those conversations landed. We reached a consensus on all these issues, or you might say a center of gravity on some. If I had unlimited time, I would go on about the working group, a very amazing effort, people who are very thoughtful and committed to getting this ordinance right for Salem. Seeing them in action makes me feel good about Salem and Salem's future. A little more background before I hand it over to Andrew to go through the content of the Climate Resiliency Overlay District Ordinance. Development in floodplains today is permitted through the Building Department, Conservation Commission, and the Planning Board. The Building Department issues permits under the State Building Code. The Conservation Commission reviews projects through the State Wetlands Protection Act, Mass DEP wetlands regulations, and Salem's Wetlands Protection Ordinance. And the Planning Board currently issues special permits under the Flood Hazard Overlay District Zoning Ordinance. As we've been saying, the Wetlands Protection Ordinance in 2022 was updated to incorporate climate change in the review of development in flood zones. That is the only box shown in green, so it's the only local regulation for flood zone permitting that considers climate change. What we propose is to create a new zoning ordinance, the Coastal Resiliency Overlay District, or CROD, that requires development in flood zones to be resilient to future flooding. That would be a planning board site plan review. At the same time, the state and federal government require that we have an ordinance that's tied to the FEMA maps that don't include any projection of future flooding. We propose to change that from a planning board special permit review to a building permit, to an administrative permit through the building department. And that will be covered in the next hearing. And we'll come back to this slide. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, members of the City Council and Planning Board, for inviting me to be here this evening. As Tom mentioned, we're going to go through some of the specific content of the CROD, the Overlay District, starting with the 4 major goals that were essentially the North Star for us in this process. These included looking at resiliency over the coming decades, wanting to minimize emergency response needs, and number 3, and I really want to pay close attention to this one, creating clear, legal, and implementable regulations, and encouraging climate adaptation appropriate to Salem's unique historic buildings and neighborhoods. So how do we define the boundaries of this new overlay district? Harkening back to what Tom mentioned a few slides ago, the 2020 Salem Sound Coast Watch organization with Woods Hole Group, they prepared this series of mapping and climate projection data that were then available to the community. Using the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, the working group with Beals and Thomas and with city staff looked at various flood projections at different year intervals and thought through what would be the most appropriate in this endeavor. So what we've selected is a 2070 projected 100-year floodplain. You're going to hear the 100-year floodplain come up a few times throughout these hearings. So the boundary of this 2070 future floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, is what is going to define the boundaries of this proposed ordinance. And it is based on Woods Hole Group's projection of 4.3 feet of sea level rise over the 2008 baseline. And I just want to also call attention to the link that we have on the map here, publicinput.com/Salem FHOD. For anybody that might be following along at home or want to refer back to this presentation, there is an interactive map on this where you can click and view properties. And you will also find a whole suite of data that talks about the technical information that went into Woods Hole Group's formation of these maps. And I believe the Salem Sound Coast Watch, the original presentation, is on there as well. What is this new overlay district applicable to? Specifically, we're looking at all new buildings except unoccupied detached accessory structures, so thinking about like small sheds and whatnot. Major renovations of large buildings, thinking 6 or more residential units or greater than 7,500 square feet for non-residential area. Also looking at major renovations of small residential buildings, looking at fewer than 6 units if we're doubling the footprint or adding a dwelling unit. And we have definitions in the ordinance of what that major renovation is. Now, what is going to be required of me? So let's say I want to do a renovation or put a new structure in this overlay district. Specifically, dwelling units and building mechanicals, so thinking things like heating, ventilation, air conditioner, they need to be situated above what is called a base flood elevation currently. And what the CROD does is it applies a sea level rise base flood elevation. So thinking back to that 100-year floodplain that's projected for the year 2070 based on the Woods Hole Group mapping, we're essentially raising the base flood elevation to where it would be projected to be in a 2070 sea level rise scenario based on the Woods Hole Group mapping. So dwelling units and mechanicals would be required to be situated above that new higher elevation. Other uses would be allowed below the sea level rise base flood elevation if they can prove to be appropriately flood proofed. And the working group also stewed over whether or not we wanted to consider enclosed parking. So we are drafting it in such a way that it will allow select enclosed parking below the sea level rise base flood elevation if there are no feasible alternatives and if an adequate management plan could be provided. And again, this would be vetted through the permitting process. There are also some activities and land uses that would be exempt, specifically looking at non-major renovations. And again, non-major, we lean heavily into the building code and how they define those. Detached unoccupied accessory structures. Divided ownership, so thinking about situations where there are condos and where a change in elevation may put you in a situation where you might be responsible for another part of the structure that you do not own, so that will be exempted from the CROD. Mechanicals that are existing and not being reconfigured or expanded. And also smaller buildings rebuilt after a catastrophe. So we're thinking less than 6 units or 7,500 square feet, again, of non-residential use. So some of these permits will be pretty straightforward. Some of them will require a little bit more creative planning in the development process. So we considered very critically about what can be done to help make this work for land use within the floodplain. So we're proposing some dimensional flexibility within the overlay district. Starting with maximum building height, we're proposing that the maximum building height for regulatory purposes will be measured from the sea level rise base flood elevation. As it pertains to the max gross floor area, the area is devoted to interior vertical circulation from the grade to that sea level rise base flood elevation, thinking ramps, stairs, elevators. Those would be excluded from the GFA, as well as areas devoted to the storage and maintenance of flood protection equipment. That they would have an opportunity to exempt that from the GFA calculation. Also thinking holistically about the lot itself, thinking about side yard setbacks, rear setbacks, allowing for areas of vertical circulation to have them access the sea level rise base flood elevation, and the storage of flood protection equipment and raised mechanicals, considering those in the rear and side yard setbacks of the parcels. While a lot of critical thought went into this, we also recognize that zoning can sometimes be a blunt tool. So we want it to be implementable and have a waiver mechanism in place for situations where a project cannot strictly comply, but we can still have some measure of protection. So these are cases that are intended to be rare cases, and it's structured in such a way as only the minimum waiver necessary would be what is issued for projects. So going through these four, whether the grade of an existing roadway or sidewalk from which the property derives its frontage makes full compliance with section 8.9.10.4, so vehicular circulation and movement of this ordinance doesn't render it impractical. If there's no practical way for it to comply with both the Climate Resiliency Overlay District and the standards of the Americans with Disabilities Act. If resiliency is achieved through innovation that is not currently foreseen in the ordinance, and understanding that innovation can sometimes be a nebulous term when it's not so defined or not known at this time, that was something that was heavily debated in the working group. So the planning board would again retain the right to peer review if something, a new engineering practice is proposed that is not currently thought through in the ordinance. Also, the protection of the building through exterior features, that might be a cause for a waiver. And again, these are intended to be the rare circumstances. Salem is rich with historic properties. I was baffled myself going through the maps of the historic parcels in relation to the flood zone and how many are within the waterfront. So it was something that the working group spent a lot of time debating and thinking through how we handle how these historic properties and structures interact with the new CROD. And what we've come up with, and Tom Devine has done so much coordination in trying to find something that works holistically, is a unique waiver that is specific to historic properties. So buildings that would be eligible for this, they're either in the local historic district, they're individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places, or they're otherwise determined to be significant by the Salem Historical Commission. And it's intended that the waiver is the minimum necessary to avoid degrading the building's historic character. So nothing superfluous, but something tied to the historic character of the structure. And there will be an opportunity for the Historical Commission to provide comments to the Planning Board through the CROD permitting process. So what is that permitting mechanism? We're proposing that this occur through site plan review with the Planning Board. Specifically, there will be a public hearing and a legal ad, abutter notices, very similar to other site plan review processes. And again, there's a mechanism in this where the Planning Board will reserve the right to solicit peer review feedback on technical matters. And it's designed to comply with the MBTA community zoning law. So to summarize, I'm going to invite questions in a moment, but this is designed to be forward-thinking, considering climate change for the future of Salem. Our goals were very clear and came from both the historic wetlands ordinance that we put together, and we'd like to invite the City Council for questions in the Planning Board, and Tom might assist me with questions as well.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Tom, and thank you to the working group for all this hard work. Questions from the council? I see Councilor Cohen first.
Thank you, President Hapworth. Through you, I get four brief ones. If you could clarify renovations, so new structures, but at what point I understand it's a 6-unit or 7,500 square feet, but can you give some examples of what renovations would enable this to be applied?
So thinking, I would defer to how it is defined in the building code first, as that is what this leans into. But off the cuff, I would consider structural changes to the interior of the building, new flooring, things of that nature, that would exceed that threshold.
Okay.
Question?
Next question. It says mechanicals not expanded or changed. I really don't understand that, because if the building is susceptible to the 2070 100-year flood, then why wouldn't you dictate new mechanicals? Because whether it's heat pumps or whatever, moving the equipment to the, above or to another structure, I don't understand why you wouldn't require that.
So the intent of that is, so if there's an existing mechanical system in place that is meeting the needs of the structure, the ordinance itself wouldn't force a renovation of that system for the owner of the structure or the developer. That could certainly be encouraged through the permitting process, but it is not obliged in that specific scenario for this.
Okay, 2 more. Thank you. I have a little difficult with the historically significant designation by the Historical Commission, because we have a demolition delay waiver of 18 months, which applies to any property in Salem that is 50 years old or 50% of the roof is altered. And just recently, in front of the Historical Commission, they deemed a garage that was made out of cinder blocks built 50 years ago, which would not be resilient under any kind of flood situation, a cinder block structure, without reinforcement of the foundation. So I'm questioning why it would apply to any property outside the historic district that's deemed historically significant, because many of those properties were deemed that way, not without any consideration of whether they can withstand any kind of adaptation issues.
Okay, that's a good question. I don't know a lot of the history of some of what you said, but the way that it is structured in here, the Historic Commission would be able to provide an advisory opinion to the Planning Board specific to the waiver, not necessarily whether or not it should be exempted. And it would only be the minimum waiver necessary tied to the historic character of the property.
I understand, but what I'm saying is that there are many properties that are not in the historic district, that are not under the purview except for this waiver consideration. And to be granted a waiver, they have to be deemed historically significant, and it could be for something as simple as cinder blocks.
I have confidence in the Historical Commission, but the ordinance doesn't put it all in their hands. They're only making an advisory opinion. The planning board still has to make the decision. I've learned a lot in recent years about the challenges of flood adaptation with historic properties. So I think it's important to have this process where there can be some relief for a property that just can't be fully raised.
I'm just thinking that maybe we look at that language at some point to make it less universal. I'm gonna just do my last one because I know there's a lot of people in the room and I want to be brief. I'm very supportive of this, but the last concern I have is the unanticipated technology for resiliency because we're going to pass an ordinance potentially fairly quickly. And we've talked about this in recent city council meetings, we can always adjust an ordinance. And, a couple of us work in the industry where, I've worked in this industry, solar heat pumps, whatever, and I'm just thinking that just to have a general thing that we're anticipating a technology that we don't know anything about, even though the ordinance is going to start rather immediately. But I'm generally in favor.
Thank you.
Any questions from the council? Councilor Jerslow.
Thank you, President. It's a lot of great work you've done. I'm just questioning the 100-year 2070 storm. In the last 5 years since 2018, in 2018 we saw 2 of the 100-year storms. And since then, every year we've seen just about a 100-year storm in our city. So I think you should be thinking more like 2030 or 2035. What is your take on that, where we've seen it over and over again? And I've been to a lot of these meetings. I've been to a lot of different things with Woods Hole peer review and everything. And every time we go to the coastal zone meetings, we show them us pictures, videos of what's actually happening. And they say, no, we look at their maps and we said, that's not right. And we show them our pictures, our videos, and they said, no, that's 2070. Well, no, it's happening now. So what do you have to say to that? Thank you.
So excellent point. It's unambiguous that these storms are becoming more frequent and they are interacting with our infrastructure in complicated ways that we are having trouble addressing across the board. How we arrived specifically at that 2070 scenario is we looked at various mappings that Woods Hole Group had available. They were the ones that prepared the data I think originally they worked on a project for Mass DOT and it eventually grew and they worked with Salem Sound Coast Watch later on in 2020. But what we had to work with and look at from them is they had various sea level rise scenarios and storm event scenarios. They had one that was, I believe it was 2030, one that was 2050, and the more conservative model, the 2070, I believe is where we've landed in our discussions with the working group. Again, 2030 is 6 years away. So the 2070 represents a higher scenario of sea level rise than had we gone with the smaller models. So I'm confident as I can be that the working group selected a model that reflected the concerns. Models are not going to be perfect, but we have to draw the district boundaries somewhere, and the mapping was certainly available to us, but I definitely register those concerns.
Going back to a question from Councilor Cohen, his last question about future technologies. Just if you could expand on that just a little bit. I think it's undoubtedly future technology and climate change are going to be linked in ways that we can't imagine. But it would seem that we could do that with almost any ordinance. So just curious why this ordinance allows for that instead of just amending the ordinance at a future time.
Yep. So there seemed to be a great interest in looking and encouraging future innovations. And there's no good way to regulate that in an ordinance without putting it in either some waiver language or having it be available to be vetted through third-party review. So this draft does both of those things. So nobody can just propose an engineering structure and have it not be vetted and use it to kind of skirt the zoning ordinance. But at the same time, there was an interest in having something in this document that looked towards the future and gestured that way. It's not so open-ended that nobody is entitled that waiver by right, but it is something that the planning board could seriously consider.
Any questions from the council? Seeing none, chair sides. And real quick, Zach, if you could speak directly into the microphone as much as possible, just so the people at home can hear what you're saying.
Thank you. Under the conditions, it notes that the planning board may, as a condition of approval, require that the applicant give notice to any prospective purchasers of the flood hazard conditions associated with the premises and any steps undertaken to alleviate these effects. Is there any reason why we wouldn't just make that a requirement across the board? Like, why give the planning board discretion as to whether or not to write that into an approval or whatnot? I'm just wondering why not just make that a requirement.
So the intent is for the planning board to reserve the right to do that. It certainly has been a blanket requirement, but there may be situations where the planning board encounters a property that warrant that. If the planning board so chooses, it could be a standard condition of the special permit. But the intent is to open the door for that. Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. No further questions from the planning board? Okay, we'll move to public comment now. Just as a reminder, you're free to make whatever public comment you like. There are 3 separate hearings happening here, so this is just about the Coastal Resiliency Overlay District. If you're wanting to make comments on the special permit versus site plan review, that is in the next section. Again, you're free to make those comments now if you like, because this is a public hearing, but there will be 3 opportunities to give public comment, and this is the first. So anybody who'd like to offer public comment, please make your way to the podium.
Thank you. Justin Whittier, 10 River Street. I am going to address that difference, but I will take the opportunity now. So there are plenty of good changes that are being presented here. Greater resilience, best practices for building, updating the building code. That seems to be all to the good. What I want to focus you all on is the loss of the planning board special permit. Losing this removes essential protections for neighborhoods and assurances of wise development. Basically, the flood hazard special permit allows the city to say no to bad developments. This change would eliminate that ability and only allow tweaking of proposals through a site plan review process. The current ordinance has 4 conditions which must be met. This change would replace those 4 conditions which must be met with toothless criteria, which should be considered. That's the language that we have at present. I think we all recognize the reality of climate change and sea level rise. I think we all recognize the folly of new construction in flood zones, period. The current planning board special permit was wisely designed to say that if there is going to be new construction, it should meet minimum standards, it should be in keeping with the character of existing neighborhoods, and it should provide safety and convenience for potential residents. So again, this proposal would eliminate that. The conditions which must be met now become criteria to be considered. Furthermore, at present, these protections extend to all neighborhoods. But under this current language, it would only apply to historic buildings or historic neighborhoods. Again, only as a consideration. So I hope that you will drill down into that and really examine that and the importance for neighborhoods of being able to look at developments in these areas and say, do these really benefit Salem? Do these really benefit our neighborhood? So, thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Tom, if you want to stop the presentation there, just so that folks at home can see the speakers. Just if you stop the screen share, there you go. Thank you. Anyone else in the chamber here that would like to give public testimony? Anybody online, if you'd like to give public testimony, please raise your hand and we'll allow you to speak. Seeing none. All right, we'll move on. I'm sorry. Councilor Morsillo. Just real quick, any further questions from the planning board or the council before we make the first motion? Councilor Morsillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the public hearing be closed.
Councilor Morsillo moves the public hearing be closed. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. Councilor Morsillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the matter be referred to the planning board for their recommendation.
Councilor Morsillo moves the matter be referred to the planning board for their recommendation. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. I think we're moving on to Tom again.
Wait, you okay?
Okay to share again?
Yep.
Madam City Clerk, do you need to read your portion here?
I'll just read the ordinance amending zoning relative to Section 8.1 Flood Hazard Overlay District, FHOD.
Are you waiting for me? Oh, sorry. I was waiting for you. Okay, moving into the next hearing for the Flood Hazard Overlay District. Here's Andrew again.
Thank you, Tom. So, as Tom started this presentation earlier, there's really two prongs of this whole project that we're working with. And this one is not...
Yeah, apologies. I think we're just going to have to live with the static for now.
All right. Uh-oh. So there are two prongs of what the working group was addressing. One being the Climate Resiliency Overlay District, which looked at the future and climate change. This one, the Flood Hazard Overlay District, we're looking at existing FEMA maps. So this is the baseline flood zoning for the city of Salem. And why are we looking at this? Because the Federal Emergency Management Agency has some mandates that communities have to meet. These mandates are not adequately addressed by the state building code or by the Wetlands Protection Act. So municipalities across the board are updating their zoning ordinances and various codes to meet these requirements. So that's sort of the baseline intent of this prong of the project, is to meet at the very least those minimum flood insurance criteria. So for this, we looked at a state model ordinance that was put together by the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. They actually have a flood office, and that was the guide that informed a lot of this effort. And so the goal is to comply with the minimum flood insurance requirements, and to also have a document that is legal, implementable, enforceable, and also meets the needs of Salem. So similar to how the CROD had boundaries that were informed by the 100-year flood zone in 2070, the Flood Hazard Overlay District, as it's currently in existence today in the ordinance, is defined by the current Essex County FEMA flood map. So that's the 100-year floodplain as depicted in the blue hatched line on this tile of a flood insurance rate map. That's just an example, one small portion of the city, but the area highlighted in blue there is the existing Flood Hazard Overlay District. And one of the things that's necessitating this change is that the flood maps are being updated. So what we're proposing is a permitting process and what is applicable in the Flood Hazard Overlay District. A permit is required for all proposed constructions or other development in the floodplain district. So this is, again, some language that we're borrowing from FEMA. And we're also, as we have the permitting process, looking at the possibility of a determination of non-applicability for some of those smaller construction activities. The building commissioner would be able to make a determination on this ordinance in the event that activities within the FHOD boundaries, they have no impact or they're de minimis or not related to flooding. And for example, roofing, windows, some interior remodeling. Again, FEMA, I'm going to repeat this a few times, they use a very expansive definition of what construction is, and that includes things like roofing and fixing windows. So that's part of the intent of, sorry, piercing that out. What is the FHOD permitting process that's being proposed? We're proposing an administrative permit through the Department of Inspectional Services with support with the Department of Planning and Community Development. So this was formerly a special permit process. And one thing that the new language requires us to do is every community in Massachusetts has to designate a floodplain administrator. So one entity within the city would function as that role. And in this case, the building commissioner is the one who is proposed to be designated with the FHOD update. So what are some of the requirements that are set forth? And to elevate residential structures above the existing, so not the 2070, the existing base flood elevation of the 100-year floodplain. So a prohibition on activities that would raise the floodplain. There's a requirement that the city provide base flood elevation data when FEMA doesn't in Zone A's for developments that are less than or greater than 5 acres or subdivisions that are greater than 50 lots. Again, some of these, they may not be as germane to the permitting traffic that Salem sees, but the language is part of requirements for federal insurance purposes. Flood protection requirements for subdivisions, standards for recreational vehicles, prohibition on the alterations of dunes that would result in increased flood damage. There's also some new administrative responsibilities that the city, as with other communities in Massachusetts, would bear, such as notifying adjacent municipalities, FEMA, and Mass DCR when there's a watercourse alteration. When new technical data is available to the city, they're required to submit that to FEMA as well. And there's a prohibition on floodway encroachments that would increase flood levels. So this tabulates some of the changes that are proposed holistically, both with this proposed flood hazard overlay district update and looking at the climate resiliency overlay district that has been sent to the planning board. Public hearing process would be done. Again, I want to stress these zones are going to overlap quite a bit too. The 100-year floodplain as it exists is going to be overlapped by the 2070 100-year floodplain. So you're going to see a lot of combined permits filed in these areas. The public hearing would be through the site plan review with the climate resiliency overlay district, requirements for complying with the underlying zoning district unless it's expressly superseded. Utilities, mechanicals, electrical systems being protected. So we have discussions of that in the CROD. Pedestrian and vehicular movement, also in the CROD. We cleaned up some language related to velocity zones. Again, this is something that is in the existing building code. Watercourse alterations, floodway encroachments, alterations of dunes, and flood resiliency for subdivisions. These will be carried in the proposed FHOD. And again, these come from that federal language that is required for property owners to maintain their federal flood insurance. So looking back kind of at the whole landscape of flood permitting in the city of Salem, what is being proposed and what is going to be considering climate change is the special permit process, the Coastal Resiliency Overlay District. The Flood Hazard Overlay District does not necessarily address resiliency. This is the baseline FEMA requirements. On the left-hand column on the second graphic, we have it in the building department situated there. So that's the proposed change with this Flood Hazard Overlay District. And at this time, I would like to invite public comments and questions.
I just want to note for the record, there's been some public comments that have come through by email from Justin Whittier, Margaret Van Dusen, Morris, and Costin. That's all.
Any questions from the council? Councilor? All right, seeing none. Chair sides. Sorry. Councilor Morsillo.
Thank you, President. Where are those found? Because I don't think we got some of those.
You sent me one of them. That was from Justin Whittier. Council President Hapworth sent me two, and Margaret Van Dusen sent me comments that she said she was sending to the city council.
Okay. I'm not sure if we got that one.
The public comments are also available in the planning board SharePoint on the salem.com website. If you go to planning board and there's a SharePoint link, 2024 folder, and then the joint public hearing, you'll see public comments there.
Any other questions from the council? Chair sides. I guess there's no further questions. Councilor Morsillo.
There's no public comment?
Sorry. We will now take public comment. I don't think there's anybody in the room here. Anybody in the room here would like to give public comment? If you're online, if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll allow you to unmute yourself. Stacia Kraft. You should be able to speak. Stacia, if you unmute yourself, you should be able to speak. Stacia, I believe you were muted just then. If you want to start over if you would have started speaking. She's showing it. Stacia, could you unmute yourself? All right, we'll come back around. Anyone else who'd like to give public testimony online? Seeing none, one more chance for Stacia Kraft. Okay, seeing none. Councilor Morsillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the public hearing be closed.
Councilor Morsillo moves the public hearing be closed. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. Councilor Morsillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the matter be referred to the planning board for the recommendation.
Councilor Morsillo moves the matter be referred to the planning board for their recommendation. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. Let's go ahead and try it again. Stacia. We can hear you, Stacia.
I think I eliminated myself by accident. So, Stacia Kraft, 140 Federal Street. 3 years ago, in 2021, over 1,800 residents signed a petition asking for a ban on new development in our flood zones and wetlands. This was after we saw the Woods Hole mapping. We were grateful that this council seemed to agree, yet we moved on to amend our wetland ordinance, which dismantled our already weak protections with an overriding waiver. As presented, this FHOD provides resilient measures with which to develop our flood zones and wetlands. This issue has been seriously addressed by our National Park Service at Derby Wharf and the House of Seven Gables. Our municipal vulnerability plan and the newly appointed environmental chief of Massachusetts recommends a managed retreat for structures already located in these areas. But we are planning for new development with quote unquote resilient methods, which in reality are really old-fashioned environmental ideas. So as presented, this FHOD will in reality streamline new development in our flood zones. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stacia. I will now move on to the third and final portion of the evening. Madam City Clerk, if you want to read your portion.
We have an ordinance amending zoning relative to section 2.2 districts by adding a new district, coastal resiliency overlay district.
Thank you. Mr. Devine.
So moving into the final hearing and what may be one of the shortest hearings in the history of the city council. Section 2.2 overlay districts, well, we'll see. Section 2 of the zoning ordinance establishes zoning districts. Subsection 2.2 establishes overlay districts. If the CROD is passed, we have to add the CROD to that list. That's all. I do have a slide to wrap up, just showing the team's contacts and
Stop.
Someone want to make a motion for a 5-minute recess?
So moved.
All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries.
so much for the shortest hearing.
All right, we return from our much longer than 5-minute recess. So just to explain to the public what's happening right now, we did have a member of the planning board that had to leave unexpectedly. So right now we are going to continue through with the third public hearing. Our city solicitor is checking case law. If we need to come back here and do this again, we'll come back here and do this again. But we'll continue with this third one and then go from there. I completely forget where we were at. I think we had finished. Yep.
I'll make no more predictions about the length of public hearings.
We leave off where Tom was jinxing the entire.
So here are the team's contacts, and here's the link to the webpage. I got an email from Councilor Watson Felt, I think, asking for this link. There it is. And I'm going to post. Okay. I was just going to say I was going to post this on the project page. If you go to the project page to find a link, but you already know it if you're there. So just to wrap up, very high level, two things happening here. A new ordinance to require resiliency to projected future worsening flooding, and an updated ordinance to require meeting federal requirements in order to maintain flood insurance eligibility. Thank you for the chance to present tonight.
Thank you, Tom, and appreciate all the work you and all the rest of this team put into this. I'll take questions from the council right now. Any councilors? Councilor Merkel.
Thank you, President Hapworth. I just want to say a very quick thank you. I know the years of work that's gone into this, and the care and the thoughtfulness and the research. And yes, a big thank you to everyone who's been involved in this for a very long length of time. Appreciate it.
Agreed. Any other questions from the council? Chair Sides. And we will take public comment. So there is nobody who's not on the planning board or the city staff here right now. So anybody remotely who would like to give public testimony, please raise your hand and we'll allow you to speak. All right, seeing none. Councilor Morsillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the public hearing be closed.
Councilor Morsillo moves the public hearing be closed. All those in favor? Any opposed? The matter carries. Councilor Morsillo.
Thank you, President. I move that the matter be referred to the planning board for the recommendation.
Councilor Morsillo moves the matter be referred to the planning board for their recommendation. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. Chair Sides, if you'd like to adjourn your meeting. Thank you, Planning Board. Councilor Prosnewski.
Move the council adjourns.
Councilor Prosnewski moves for adjournment. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.